Boris Johnson loves playing games. Using a warped wooden racket, the London mayor plays doubles with his siblings.
Oh yes.
One is an eco-businessman, one a Tory MP, and the third is a mischievous journalist. Boris Johnson is a formidable and unorthodox competitor.
Gotcha. Yeah, I like it.
His love of life has helped make him the country's most popular politician.
Private Eye, we call him Beano Boris, because he's a character from an old-fashioned cartoon strip. Everything's cripes and blimey and chaps and plough.
But those who know him claim there are at least two different Boris Johnsons.
He's a sly fox disguised as a teddy bear.
Behind the clown mask is said to lurk a deadly serious political operator, determined to get to the top, despite his colourful private life.
He said, have you got any advice? And I said, yes. Lock up your Willie.
This film examines what really makes Boris tick, and whether he's a man to trust, and whether he could replace his fellow Etonian at number 10.
He knows that life is a competition, and he always wants to be top.
And Boris Johnson speaks more candidly in this film about his chances of grabbing the top job than he's ever done before.
This programme was such a bad idea.
This is Boris Johnson, aged 5, paddling his own canoe in the river that runs through the family farm in Somerset. There wasn't any evidence then of the modern obsession with health and safety. The Eton and Oxford educated mayor of London has routinely broken the conventional rules of politics and often found himself in deeply troubled waters. But though he had a pedigree English education, Boris Johnson has an exotic mongrel background.
My brothers and sisters and me were like the honey you used to get that said a produce of more than one country. You know, we're from all over the place. So we've got Turkish, German, French, Russian, international Jewry. You know, the lot.
The blonde gene, which is so strong in the prolific Johnson clan, is thought to come from a flaxen-haired slave girl whom one of his ancestors married. Boris Johnson's great-grandfather was a Turkish journalist and politician assassinated by a nationalist mob. His mother is a painter, his father an environmentalist who once worked for MI6. The Johnsons were living in New York when Boris was born.
I wasn't actually present at the birth because I'd been hanging in there for quite a long time. Then I popped out to get a pizza. As one does when I came back, the baby had been born.
Boris was a champion when he was born because not only was he very big, looked as though he was ready for prep school, but he had thick yellow hair. It was most extraordinary. And it was the time when the Beatles had just arrived in New York. So he got called the Blonde Beetle. And all the mothers who were expecting babies and to have them in that hospital were brought in to see the Blonde Beetle.
Boris was the first of numerous Johnson children who grew up in a super-competitive household. Boris says it was all sparked off by the birth of his sister Rachel.
I shall never forget the expression on Boris's face when he arrived at the hospital and saw me holding a new baby. The expression on his face is indescribable, but one of shock, disbelief, and fear.
My life was one of blameless, panda-like passivity until my younger sister arrived 18 months later. There I was. I had everything an 18-month-old could possibly desire, and suddenly I found that I had this competition in the form of Rachel. And it was necessary to exert myself for food, for attention, for everything else.
I learnt to read before he did, and this gave us a huge kick up the pants. Because my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, used to ask me to read out Times Leaders when I was 4, and then would turn to him and say, "She reads much better than you." So he's always been a competitor, right from the age of 14 months. You know, he knows that life is a competition, and he always wants to be top.
Boris seemed to have inherited his competitive gene and his blonde hair from his father. But he also has some of his mother's more artistic side. He remains an accomplished painter. This is a self-portrait Boris Johnson did when he was just 12.
Whenever anyone asked him what he wanted to be, he would answer world king. That is true. And that's what he thought. He thought that was a job that he could do, and he would fulfill every criterion.
The early life of Boris and his 3 siblings was one that was constantly on the move. As an environmental consultant, Stanley Johnson was regularly posted to new places in Europe and America. And the Johnsons moved house 30 times in 15 years. It made for what Rachel Johnson describes as a rackety childhood, made worse when their mother suffered a nervous breakdown and was away from her 4 children in hospital for 8 months.
When I was in hospital, they became very close to each other because we had a series of dotty nannies and housekeepers looking after them. And they grew very close to each other and very protective of each other. And Boris was always very protective of the younger children.
Boris was sent to Eton on a scholarship aged 13. The school has produced a third of Britain's prime ministers, including the current incumbent, who was known at Eton as Cameron Minor.
I do remember Dave. I'm fairly certain someone said to me once, "That's Cameron Mai," and there was this tiny chap. I dimly remember.
Johnson's relationship with Cameron Minor would be a recurrent theme throughout his life. But at Eton, it was Johnson who became the school star.
Boris was clearly somebody out of the ordinary. I mean, he always had shaggy hair, he always had a rather plummy voice, he was always very sort of physical, a rugger player from an early stage. He always had great humour and a tremendous drive and seriousness, which sometimes is belied by the humour, but was undoubtedly there.
Do you think that Eton increased your sense of competitiveness?
Yes, and that was a good thing. And I'd encourage that.
Boris Johnson was such a tough competitor that he broke his nose 4 times on the playing fields of Eton. And he learnt on a different school stage that he could break the conventional rules to his advantage.
It was at Eton he discovered he could make people laugh. When he was in a French play and he had to recite Molière and he hadn't bothered to learn his lines and he hid behind a pillar reading them out, which was obviously much funnier than if he'd learnt them perfectly and had stood on the stage and declaimed them.
Do you think that you learnt something for later life from acting in plays at Eton, that you could actually get more laughs by looking as if you don't know your lines than actually remembering them?
Well, I certainly think that as a general tactic in life, if that's what you're driving at, it is often useful to give the slight impression that you are deliberately pretending not to know what is going on, because the reality may be that you don't know what is going on, but people won't be able to tell the difference.
This is why he's dementing for other politicians, because they're all, to an extent, playing a part assigned to them by the party. You know, you have to be loyal, you have to be a good Tory. Boris has realised quite early on that he would go further if he broke all those rules, and people would love him even more, which is brilliant, genius piece of casting.
While he was at Eton, Boris Johnson learned that his mother and father were breaking up and they were getting divorced.
I often thought that his being world king was a wish to make himself unhurtable, invincible, somehow safe from the pains of life, the pains of your mother disappearing for 8 months, the pains of your parents splitting up.
It was at Eton that the would-be world king learnt to play by his own rules. When he was 18, his housemaster wrote, "I think Boris honestly believes it's churlish of us not to regard him as an exception, one who should be free of the network of obligation that binds everyone else. Johnson was elected a member of Eton's elite group, which could wear its own fancy waistcoats, and he was made captain of the school. The fact that Cameron didn't achieve either honour is something he's often privately reminded of by Johnson.
I remember at the end of school, you write messages with photographs, they're called levers. You send them to your friends. And I can actually remember what I wrote to him. He wasn't one of the great characters of Eton. He's one of the great characters of Eton history.
When the 18-year-old Boris left Eton, he posted this picture of himself in the leaving book. And underneath it, he wrote that his next ambition was to achieve more notches on my phallocratic phallus. In other words, his almighty male organ. Johnson had won an Oxford scholarship to study classics, and he was determined to grab more of life's glittering prizes.
There being 167 votes in favour of the motion and 85 against, I declare the motion overwhelmingly carried, and I close the House at 12:18 a.m.
Johnson was elected President of the Oxford Union in his third year. The university's famed debating society was known as the playground of power. Many of its presidents would go on to become prime ministers. But Johnson's path to the top hadn't been smooth. He developed what he called Tory tendencies. And when he first stood for the presidency, his political opponents depicted him as a right-wing Old Etonian toff who thought he was born to rule. As the polls closed, he went to find the result.
When I got there, it was pretty clear that I wasn't going to win. And I tell you, it was like all harrowing and shattering defeats, it was very good for me. It was it's just what the doctor ordered.
Boris would later develop his skill at putting on a brave face into an art form. He was visited in his college rooms by his mother, his two brothers, and his sister Rachel, who was now also at Oxford. He decided the only way he could win the Union presidency was by broadening his political base. And the party making all the running was the SDP, the newly formed centre-left party.
The SDP were in search of a candidate, and it would be fair to say that whilst I never identified myself as a supporter of the SDP, when asked if I would accept SDP support, I did not demur. In other words,
Boris was a political chameleon. I think it was almost like a blank screen in which people could project their own political views. From his point of view, he didn't need to be party political. If he wanted to be elected president of the Union, he did not want to alienate anybody. So he allowed people to think whatever they wanted to think. That was pretty smart.
He was exactly as you see him now, charming, ruthless, single-minded, determined. He wanted to be president of the Union, and he got there.
Johnson had become president by appealing across party lines, a skill that would later serve him well. He'd also been elected to Oxford's most secretive elite group, the notorious Bullingdon Club. The all-male dining society's members included David Cameron, who has long wanted this photo to disappear. Members of the Bulla feel bound by strict vows of omerta and normally refuse to speak publicly about the club.
Ah, yes. I congratulate you on defying the censors and bringing this appalling image once again before public view. It is a truly shameful vignette of almost superhuman undergraduate arrogance and toffishness and twittishness, I suppose. But, it was great fun at the time. Or was it? Actually, the awful truth about all that business was you kind of felt very, posh, and you felt it was wonderful to be going around swanking this up, but actually, I remember the dinners being incredibly, drunken and
ending up with smashing up restaurants.
Well, yes, and the abiding feeling was of deep self-loathing, and what.
I've talked to a number of the people in the photograph,
have you? All right.
and they say that when they see you these days, you go up to them and say, "Bulla, bulla, bulla."
Right. Do they?
Yes, they do.
It may be that I do, in a satirical way.
In his public role as president of the union, Johnson had become one of the best-known figures in the university.
I was editor of the Daily Telegraph, and I went as a guest to join a debate at the Oxford Union. And there was Boris in all his glory as president of the union, his white tie and tails and all the rest of it.
The House will proceed to a division.
It was obvious all the girls were potty about him. Nobody was looking at me for 2 minutes. They were all looking at Boris.
Honourable members voting against the motion will sit on the benches on my left.
Watching President Boris most closely was his girlfriend, Allegra Mostyn-Owen. She was the student regarded as the great beauty of her day at Oxford.
Allegra had modelled, she'd been on the cover of magazines. She always was immaculately turned out. And then standing next to her was this very dishevelled figure of Boris Johnson. The rumours were that he got her to wash and iron his shirts for him. They didn't appear to have been washed and ironed by anyone.
The couple married soon after they both came down from Oxford. Boris Johnson had got an upper second in classics, not the first-class degree he'd coveted. And he was disappointed to learn that David Cameron did get a first in politics, philosophy and economics. Johnson had become a trainee reporter for The Times, but after he concocted a quote for an article he wrote about the Plantagenet King Edward II and his gay lover, The Times let him go.
It was awful. I remember a deep sense of shame and guilt and just not, you know how you just not knowing how to sort it out, and it was a bit of a bummer, frankly.
But not for the only time, Johnson fell on his feet. He managed to move downriver to another job at the Daily Telegraph. Its editor, Max Hastings, whom Boris had cannily invited to speak at the Oxford Union, made him the paper's man in Brussels.
We realised that Boris was very bright. We wanted somebody punchy, aggressive, original in Brussels to really get onto the whole EU issue, which was then really becoming very big stuff in British politics. And we just looked around for our brightest and available young man, and Boris looked like it, and he did not disappoint our hopes.
Oui, je crois que les Français a réussi avec une fantastique embuscade, avec cette histoire de la monnaie unique avant 99. C'était un complot français.
The multilingual Johnson became a Eurosceptic reporter. He ridiculed the Brussels Commission with his gift for a phrase and his nose for a good story. From Euro manure to one-size-fits-all condoms, little escaped Johnson's eye. A number of the EU correspondents I've talked to said that you would take stories with a grain of truth and then hype it up almost beyond recognition.
Well, I mean, you know, I think there's a bit of pots and kettles going on there. Yes, there were one or two stories which perhaps, in retrospect, either because you'd slightly miscued the story yourself or because it got souped up in some way in its projection and, you know, the thing was a little bit over-egged or whatever. I think I once said that the Berlaymont was going to be blown up, which didn't turn out to be quite true.
The Berlaymont, the headquarters of the Brussels Commission, is still standing. But Johnson's growing Euroscepticism would help shape his own political future. Yet just as his Brussels reports were making his name, a story linked to his Oxford past came back to haunt him. It involved a fellow Bullingdon Club member, Darius Guppy, a long-time friend of Johnson from their days at Eton and Oxford together.
We did have a serious embarrassment with Boris when he was in Brussels, when one fine morning, on my desk along with a post, I find a tape and a note from a reader who's saying, what are you as editor-in-chief of the Daily Telegraph proposing to do about one of your correspondents, Boris Johnson, having this conversation with Darius Guppy, a convicted fraudster?
The tape was a recording of Guppy telephoning to ask Johnson to find the home address of an inquisitive journalist whom Guppy wanted to scare off. 20 years on, we filmed for the first time Johnson listening to extracts from the tape.
But I am telling you something, Boris. This guy has got my blood up, all right? And there is nothing which I won't do to get my revenge. It's as simple as that.
How badly are you going to hurt this guy?
Not badly at all. He will not have a broken limb or broken arm, and he will not be put into intensive care or anything like that. He'll probably get a couple of black eyes and a cracked rib or something like that. Nothing which you didn't suffer in rugby, okay? But you'll get scared, and that's what I want him to do.
Okay, Derry, I said I'll do it. Don't worry.
Boris, I really mean it. I love you.
Yes. Taken out of context, that conversation could indeed seem embarrassing.
It's completely in context.
I hasten to, the reality is nothing eventuated from that conversation. It is perfectly true.
But you didn't. The point is, you didn't demur when he said this guy will be beaten up and
yes,
couple of broken ribs and so on. This is a friend of yours who wants the details of a journalist who's making his life a misery, and you said you would get the address and so on.
Well,
I said I'd do it, Derry. I'll do it.
Yeah. Nothing eventuated from that conversation. It was what can I say? Nobody.
What do you feel hearing it again now? Because you were laughing.
Well, obviously, I feel indignation that people take my private phone calls. That's what I feel, and I feel what a load of old cobblers. That's what I feel.
15 years ago, the Guppy tape drew Johnson straight into an elephant trap.
Why? Boris was caught on tape as well.
Ha ha ha! Richly comic. Yes, that's.
Boris was on tape talking to Darius Guppy. His
a very great man. I don't want to be totally stitched up here.
What you want and what you don't want.
No, he was a school friend, wasn't he?
A great chap, yeah.
And a great chap, despite being a convicted fraudster.
Convicted fraud, went very, very sadly wrong.
Yeah.
Major goof.
And one of the ways he went wrong is ringing you up on tape and suggesting that you help him beat up a journalist who was looking into him.
That did come up. I won't deny that did come up. I'm not ashamed of it.
What are you not ashamed of, though, Boris?
Whatever there is not to be ashamed of.
Boris had bumbled so endearingly that he became a regular on Have I Got News For You.
There is a sense of guilt that part of Boris's success has been built on his performances on that show. And I know Paul feels very ambivalent about whether he should be proud of helping this man to become mayor, let alone the next Prime Minister or whatever fate we've got coming for us.
Boris Johnson survived the Guppy incident when Max Hastings let him off with a severe warning to behave himself. He'd returned to London as the Telegraph's star political columnist and was much in demand on celebrity TV. Johnson so impressed Conrad Black, the notorious Telegraph Group proprietor, that he made him editor of The Spectator. Johnson promised he wouldn't seek to become an MP while he was editor, but he almost immediately broke his word, to Black's fury.
Boris is a scoundrel. I said to him, you just can't do this. I mean, not to us, anyway. So that was, we kind of took that as the cue that, yes, he could go on and be as devious as he wanted, as long as we weren't the victims of it, you see.
Boris had married Marina Wheeler after his first marriage had broken down. She was a successful left-wing lawyer who didn't share her husband's love of the limelight, but she put in a rare public appearance when Johnson was selected as the Tory candidate for the safe seat of Henley-on-Thames.
I'm amazed, bowled over, and thrilled beyond my wildest dreams. Thank you, Marina, for turning up.
Johnson duly won Henley in the 2001 general election, which saw David Cameron also become an MP for a nearby seat in Oxfordshire. Both men were quickly marked out as Tories to watch. Johnson, who was 37, continued to edit The Spectator, even when he was promoted to being a junior shadow minister. He characteristically believed he could get the best of both worlds.
Well, I said my policy on cake was pro-having it and pro-eating it. I did a kind of circus act where I had these two ponies, and gradually they got further and further apart, and with inevitable results.
Johnson found himself regularly in trouble when his mischief-making Spectator articles were taken to be official Tory policy. On top of that, the tabloids reported he was having a long-term love affair with Petronella Wyatt, who was one of his staff. Johnson dismissed the reports as an inverted pyramid of piffle and arrived at a Spectator Awards lunch.
Johnson, I'll collect in a minute, thanks.
The Tory leader, Michael Howard, had accepted Johnson's denial, but couldn't resist ribbing his shadow minister.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Boris. There is nothing like the Spectator for stirring up and stimulating political controversy. Indeed, in all senses of the word, it could best be described as political Viagra. Keep it up, Boris.
Johnson said, "That's below the belt." 2 days later came confirmation of the affair.
Good morning, Boris.
And Michael Howard sacked Johnson for lying to him.
I don't, if it's all right with you, wish to, and I understand why you have to bring all this sort of thing up. I don't particularly want to get into stuff that, done and dusted, and very largely concerns my private life.
Well, very largely concerned, but it's also a political thing, because as a result of this, you were forced to resign from the front bench. So
I was sacked. Let's be clear,
right,
I was sacked.
Okay.
Let's not muck. I mean, I said sack me or sack me.
Yeah. And he sacked you.
Yeah.
I suppose in a way you've made it worse for yourself, because you had publicly said that these stories about this love affair were an inverted pyramid of piffle, which you said with your characteristically inventive language, and then it turned out to be true. So can you see why people don't necessarily always feel they can take you at your word?
Yeah, I mean, all that kind of thing, which, as I say, very largely concerns private, has been the subject of exhaustive questioning put to me over many years. I had to leave the Spectator one way or another, all that turned out for the best in my view.
One of Howard's chief advisors was David Cameron, and I asked Cameron at the time about Johnson's sacking in an interview that hasn't been seen before. Did you think it was a good idea for Michael Howard to sack Boris Johnson?
It's obviously that's one for him rather than for me, but I think there's a very difficult issue when you've said one thing publicly and then you have to say something else publicly, and even though it's about your private life, when you're talking to the press, it becomes part of your public life, and that's incredibly tough. But I think that is something that you've got to deal with in one way or another.
You haven't really answered the question.
Well, the short answer is yes. I think that was given the circumstances, I think that was the right decision. But Boris is a very close friend of mine and colleague, and it was obviously a very tough time for him as well.
Boris, are you going to see if you're married?
I'm going to do whatever I can to say, oh God, they've locked me out.
Boris was in the doghouse. His wife kicked him out of the house for 3 weeks.
I think all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds.
And he was out of a job. He realised his political career had stalled. And he watched as David Cameron, his Eton and Bullingdon buddy, dramatically overtook him by winning the Tory leadership race in 2005. Cameron excluded Johnson from his inner circle. While professing loyalty to his new leader, at the party conference, Boris stole the headlines from Dave. Johnson, who was soon to have another affair, exceeded his shadow brief by publicly contradicting Cameron.
What do you do with a problem like Boris? Boris has strong views about lots of things. I try to get him to stick to higher education, and I think that's probably the right answer.
In fact, it was to turn out that Cameron had other plans to make use of Boris Johnson's undoubted media celebrity and public name recognition. Having failed to find a suitable Tory candidate to stand for Mayor of London, Cameron sounded Boris out.
I remember when Boris was trying to decide whether he would run as Mayor of London. He asked me out to lunch, and I said I thought he should go for it. I thought he could do it, and I thought he'd do it very well, all of which I think I was right about. But he said, "Have you got any advice?" And I said, "Yes, lock up your Willie."
After some dithering, Johnson decided he would stand for mayor. Many people at the time thought it was a hopeless cause. London was traditionally Labour, and the incumbent mayor, Ken Livingstone, had seemed to make the job his own.
I think it's an excellent opportunity for London to have someone who I think can unite Londoners, can inspire Londoners, and can give leadership to what is one of the greatest city in the world, and it needs a great leader.
One of them. It
Sorry,
is the greatest city in the world. London is the greatest city in the world. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you.
No, I'd finish.
You're making a very good point. It's a fantastic chance to change the government of London and to institute a new type and style of administration in this city.
I recognised immediately he said he was going to run. This was going to be my most formidable opponent, because people laugh. They knew I would never miss Have I Got News For You when he was on. I'd almost fall off the chair. That's a very powerful quality. Boris makes people feel good about themselves. It's an incredibly powerful force to have in politics. Not many people have got that. He therefore can get away with a lot.
Though his popular appeal wasn't in doubt, his mayoral candidacy raised the key question: which was the real Boris Johnson? Was he competent and serious enough to do a big job, or was he just a gaffe-prone joker who flew by the seat of his pants?
He gets up incredibly early, and then he will run, and then he'll have breakfast, and he'll write a speech, and he'll go to work. I mean, he's already done a full day's work by 8 o'clock.
Because there is this extraordinary sort of contrast between that sort of drivenness and how he seems to look as if he's a shambles.
Yeah, it's very, very clever. Yeah.
Boris isn't pretending to be chaotic. He really is utterly chaotic. And getting Boris to do his expenses or to fill in pieces of paper or sign forms is an almost impossible task. He's always been like that. And in a way, it's a form of, it's unusual. He's got discipline when he wants to have it, when he thinks something's important enough, that if it's something that is going to seriously promote his interests, Boris will be there at the right time on the right day.
He's a sly fox disguised as a teddy bear. He's very clever and he's very likable.
Do you trust him?
Do I trust him not to betray me personally? Yes, I do. Do I trust him to do everything he says he will do if doing it subsequent to his promising to do it gets in the way of the shortest possible distance between where he is and where his ambition wishes to take him? No, I do not.
David Cameron was delighted when Johnson beat Livingstone to become London Mayor in 2008, as it showed the Tories, then still in opposition, could win in a traditional Labour stronghold.
I remember a terrifying sense of responsibility and the real weight of the sense that I'd taken on something that was of massive importance to millions of people, and I jolly well better get it right.
Johnson regarded his new job as a public audition for an even higher political stage. To help project his image, he appointed a former BBC political reporter as his chief spin doctor. Gita Hari has never talked publicly before about his role.
What I thought was that there was a mission there over 4 years of taking him from celebrity to statesman, but crucially without losing the celebrity.
One of Gita Hari's first photo calls for the mayor was to promote a clean-up of London rivers. The mayor had made the wrong kind of splash, one of a number of early pratfalls.
Thank you.
To help fight crime in London, Johnson had appointed as his deputy mayor Ray Lewis. He saw Lewis as an inspirational figure with a direct line to disaffected black youths. But Lewis came under harsh public scrutiny when he was reported to have souped up his CV. The mayor was determined to stand by his man. But in an agonised meeting at City Hall, with his enemies calling for Lewis's head, Johnson was reluctantly forced to concede that his deputy mayor was dead in the water after just 8 weeks. Just tell me the story of when it became clear Ray Lewis had to go.
You infandum your bays renovari dolorum. You're asking me to go over terror. You want to renew the misery. You want what do you want from me?
I want your account of what it was like for you. When here was a guy who you'd brought in.
Yeah.
He was symbolic.
He was, yeah.
And then he had to go.
It was a grim business. It was, and I feel sad thinking about it, but maybe that was a function of being so new in the post. How about that?
Ray Lewis wasn't the only one of Boris Johnson's newly appointed team of advisers to run into trouble.
Today, David Ross resigned from his position, the fourth key advisor to go since the mayor took office.
There was an expectation that the Boris mayoralty would be a disaster, and there were a number of people who fell by the wayside in the first few months. But with Boris, it was taken as evidence that he really couldn't organise the proverbial, drink session in a brewery.
Ironically, Johnson had inherited the responsibility for organising the biggest party in London's history, the forthcoming Olympic Games.
I don't think that Boris had remotely understood the size and complexity and scope and scale of it. And I think at first he probably came there thinking that this was a sort of a bit of an extravaganza. Did London need it? Am I going to have loads of resources diverted from other things? I just think he looked at it as something that he didn't grasp.
I think what Seb is saying has a grain of truth. I did start off being probably for him and for Lowcog, but I think they began to think, oh God, is the mayor going to start screwing things up? But I rapidly became an evangelical believer in it.
I'm sure the public persona, the public perception is that this is somebody that sort of bumbles from decision to decision and from event to event. It's much, much sharper than that. He knows exactly what he's doing. I don't believe there's a moment of his day that isn't choreographed to either London or him.
After his shaky first few months, Johnson was developing his own way of playing the role of mayor. Although he had relatively few formal powers, he saw himself as London's champion. Recalling his immigrant roots, Johnson viewed the city as a dynamic melting pot that could help power Britain's economic recovery.
Bonjour, c'est moi, Boris Johnson, le maire de Londres.
Здравствуйте, друзья. Меня зовут Boris. Have a very, very happy Chinese New Year, everybody. Kung Hei Fat Choi.
The key place that Boris Johnson would bang the drum for London was in Whitehall.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We've got a very special...
By now, David Cameron was Prime Minister, and the two men would engage in friendly sparring in public.
Boris kills it.
But behind the scenes, their political rivalry was much fiercer. When Number 10 announced cuts in housing benefits that would worst affect London's poorest families, Johnson launched an uncompromising assault on the Cameron government.
We will not accept any kind of Kosovo-style, social cleansing of London. You are not going to see, on my watch, you are not going to see thousands of families being evicted from the place where they've been living and where they have put down roots. That is not what Londoners want to see. It's not what we are going to accept.
Johnson's social cleansing jibe infuriated Cameron, and sources close to the Prime Minister hit back.
The 11 o'clock daily briefing to journalists came at Number 10, and it was one of the rare occasions, to be fair with the Prime Minister, where somebody in Number 10 authorised, a pretty brutal briefing against Boris.
The next day's headlines reflected the tension between the two men. It was one of a series of clashes that the mayor would have with the Prime Minister.
Almost all the arguments are about us trying to get a better deal for London and to make sure that the government doesn't make a mistake. And sometimes I will say something that seems to be very critical of the government or of government policy, and yes, a lot of plaster comes off the ceiling, but that is the job of the mayor.
Johnson was reshaping the mayor's job in his own image. When he persuaded Barclays to promise £50 million for his cycle hire scheme, The bank wanted them known as Barclays Bikes, but almost inevitably they became Boris Bikes. And brand Boris even advertised himself on the BBC's most popular programme.
I'm going to have a pint of bitter.
It's such an honour to have you here, Mr. Mayor.
Oh, please call me Boris.
I nearly went into politics myself, you know.
Really? Well, if you have any ideas for how I could help Walford, here's my card.
Thank you so much.
Good.
Yet Boris Johnson's winning manner was to land him back in the soup. He was a risk-taker, as he showed when he promoted a volunteering scheme at a go-kart track. And there were new reports that the mayor hadn't been following Max Hastings' advice to keep himself zipped up. It was claimed he was having an affair with an art dealer who he'd made his unpaid advisor on urban sculpture. David Cameron was later to joke he was going to give Johnson a book called The Joy of Cycling. But Johnson himself was again kicked out of his house, and Cameron's then spin doctor Andy Coulson advised the mayor he should hold a confessional press conference. Johnson vetoed the idea. He argues that the public isn't interested in his private life, and he's imposed what might be called a blanket ban on talking about it.
The difficulty is that one statement invariably poses another question, and one thing, one line of inquiry leads to another.
All right, okay. You don't want to lift any. If you talked about your private life, there would be more interesting things that would come out.
Just to go back to what I was saying just now, again, I admire your journalistic technique, but I think I've given you the answer that I'm going to give.
Boris has been fantastic copy for the Eye. I mean, all the way through. From his earliest performances as an MP, through to the massed infidelities, which sort of littered the career. I mean, he's our Berlusconi, but somehow it's funnier.
Yeah, I like it.
The bounder Boris bounced back once again, but he was in for a rude awakening. When the London riots broke out in the summer of 2011, the mayor was on a family holiday in a camper van in the Canadian Rockies. Johnson at first refused to return home, but then changed his mind. He headed for South London, scene of some of the worst rioting. And for a change, he was met by a hostile crowd who wanted to know why the police had gone AWOL.
Let me tell you, tonight...
You talk about robust policing,
Yeah.
what does that actually mean?
Tonight we are going to have a huge number of police on the streets, and I understand
Where
that.
were they? At 5 o'clock we knew they were going to hit, and no one was here. I was in the salon when a brick got through the wall, through the window, and no one was here to defend me.
And that is why we are putting many more police on the street. It was tough, and then people felt angry because they'd seen their shops, their property attacked, and sod it, the sodding mayor had been somewhere else.
Back in City Hall, Johnson worried that the riots might have wrecked his pitch for London and his chances of re-election. But in his first term, he'd carved out a reputation as his own man, and he was far from an identikit right-winger. He has an unpredictable mix of beliefs. He's pro-banker, pro-immigrant, a Eurosceptic who's pro-gay marriage, but likes to be seen as tough on crime.
They just brought me to see you. Selection, is it? Special selection, yeah. Sure. Yeah, not enough.
Last mayor's mayoral election was a Johnson v Livingston rematch. Each man accused the other of being a tax avoider.
No, you don't avoid tax on that. You don't avoid tax. You have to pay tax on the money you take out. If you want to do tax avoidance, you do what his employers do.
Can I get a word in edgewise?
Following that programme, the two men had nearly come to blows, but it was the mayor who sought to kiss and make up.
What I found amazing was here is someone who very well may be Prime Minister one day, may have to lead the nation, and he was worried that I was angry with him. And this is a breathtaking weakness in a politician. He wants to be loved even by the people he's destroying.
Johnson once more beat Livingstone, and after 4 years working and playing as hard as he'd ever done in his life, the mayor, who has the ability to take a power nap anywhere, recharged his batteries in preparation for the summer of 2012. The London Olympics really took off with the rally in Hyde Park. The Games gave Boris Johnson an unparalleled opportunity to project himself as London Mayor to the whole country and across the world.
Folks, I've never seen anything like this in all my life. The excitement is growing so much. I think the Geiger counter of Olympomania is going to go zoink off the scale. Are we ready? Are we ready? Yes, we are. The venues are ready, the stadium is ready, and our Team GB athletes are ready, aren't they? They're going to win more gold, silver, bronze medals than you'd need to bail out Greece and Spain together. Final question. Can we put on the greatest Olympic Games that has ever been held in any city? Can we?
Well, I was very lucky to be mayor at the time of the Olympic Games, is all I can say. And it was a jammy old trick to pull.
But what was it like for you to hear that huge crowd chanting, Boris, Boris, Boris?
Very, very bad
people.
for you. I mean, don't do it. I mean, I'm very, very bad for the ego. But you do understand why Roman emperors put on great games and great spectacle. I mean, suddenly you think, wow, this is obviously a big thing. So, you know.
So, I mean, would you like to be a Roman emperor?
No. They invariably came to sticky ends.
He'd fly through the air with the greatest of ease, a daring young man on the flying trapeze. His movements were graceful, for girls he could please, and my love...
A sticky end was the mot juste for Johnson's celebrated trip, which climaxed with the daring young mayor stuck on the zip wire.
I want you to know it's going well. It's very, very well organised. Get me a ladder.
I want you to know that was far more painful and frightening than you might think.
In what way?
Because it was, to start with, it was jolly high up. And after you stuck up there for a while,
yeah,
stuff starts to chafe and so on and so forth.
Well, around your groin?
You know, I don't want to go into these details, Michael. I mean, it was chafing was involved. But
I thought you wrote in your book.
Did I? Right.
Yeah. I'm only quoting you, Boris. This is what's so difficult. I quote you.
I can never remember what I've written. Okay.
You said it got very, very tight around your groin area.
Did it? Right. Well, if that's why I wrote in my book, it must be absolutely correct.
If any other politician anywhere in the world got stuck on a zip wire, it would be, disastrous. For Boris, it'll be an absolute triumph. There's he defies all forms of gravity.
His Olympotastic performance enhanced his image as a political celebrity.
Boris. Morning. How are you, sir?
When you turn them back on, have I got news for you?
I know. Those days are over. They won't let me...
The mayor is able to connect with a range of people outside the Tories' stockade. It's a rare gift for an Eton and Bullingdon boy.
No more cuts.
No more cuts.
He is the only feel-good politician we have in Britain. Everybody else is far too busy being responsible, or telling you that austerity is going to be very miserable, or that things are tough, or that toughness is required. What Boris does is make people feel good.
At last year's Tory conference, there was a hero's welcome for the mayor who'd again won in Labour London and was reaping the dividend of a successful Olympics. He was able to indulge in a favourite pursuit of teasing the Prime Minister.
Where is Dave? He's going to be here somewhere. Good morning, everybody. There you are, Dave. I know that Dave will win in 2015 when the economy has turned around and when people are benefiting from the tough decisions
you have taken, not least coming on to hear this speech today. So many, happy birthday, by the way. Happy birthday, by the way.
I couldn't help laughing when Boris was making his speech, "Where's Dave?" And poor David Cameron, the wretched Prime Minister, is obliged to laugh heartily. I think that David Cameron would actually like to have sort of whacked him to death on the spot.
While Cameron applauds dutifully, his people mutter darkly that Boris isn't a team player and he's always scheming to steal the PM's thunder. Often there's that pattern where he seemed to want to upstage the Prime Minister.
9 times out of 10, the row is about something of substance, not some sort of game being played between him and the Prime Minister.
And the 10th time?
10th time, there's a sense of mischief that goes back 30 years to school, and we all know how we are with school friends, and we all know the assumptions we have with them, and even if one of them has ended up as Prime Minister and the other as Mayor of London, to a certain extent, they're both there in their short shorts in Eton, sort of sparring with each other slightly.
That view of the importance of the Eton connection to the Cameron-Johnson relationship is shared by the Mayor's sister.
What I've seen is when they're together, it's rather sweet because David Cameron sort of slightly, even though he's taller, looks at Boris as if he's still head boy. And
Gee, thanks, Rick. This programme was such a bad idea.
These relationships are set very early. It's like birth order. So people shouldn't forget that. He was head boy. Cameron was 2 years younger, the young pup.
So doesn't that make Boris rather resentful if he's got...
No, I think it gives Boris a sense of continuing superiority.
Really?
Why wouldn't it? He was head boy, captain of the school.
That is my sister at her very best, and she is brilliantly causing trouble.
But is there something in what Rachel says? Keto Harry told us that when there are rows between you and David Cameron, 9 times out of 10 it's about serious politics, but on the 10th it goes back to your time at Eton when you were both in short trousers.
I don't think that's fair. I mean, I think there's a lot of sort of psychobabble about personal relationships. Actually, it comes down to the necessity, the hard necessity as mayor of a great capital city to go into number 10 and fight for funding for Crossrail or whatever it happens to be, and to make sure by hook or by crook that you come out with what you need.
In his 5 years as mayor, Johnson's political stock has constantly risen. But though he's now often talked of as a future Prime Minister, it's a frightening prospect for some who know him well.
He is still pretty wild. He is still a pretty wild card. And I, for one, just supposing Boris became Prime Minister, the idea of Boris's finger on the nuclear button, one day getting mixed up with a button to call the maid or something.
The classic question I get is, can you imagine him with his finger on the nuclear trigger? That sends shivers down many spines. For me, I can imagine if Boris did have his finger on the nuclear trigger, he would be guided by all kinds of classical considerations of how bad decisions had caused carnage for centuries thereafter, and he would be wise in the decision that he took.
Keto Harry says if Boris were Prime Minister, the thought of Boris Johnson's finger on the trigger, most people say, it sends shivers down their spines.
Well, as I say, the shiver can remain firmly up their spine or wherever the shiver has no need to go anywhere, because the chances of my being in a position to send such a shiver or such a nuclear warhead are vanishingly small.
Despite his protestations, many of the people who know Boris best have no doubt about his ambition and desire to reach number 10. And his father even believes he should put himself in the running for the Tory leadership by returning to Westminster as an MP before the next election, while he is still Mayor of London.
If Boris were to ask my advice on the question of whether he ought to be considering being a candidate in the next election, okay, I'm talking about the election of 2015, I would say to him, put your hat in the ring, because he has done a fantastic job as mayor, and why not go for leader of the party? And if there's some mechanical thing saying he has to be a member of Parliament, well, don't tell me we can't get over that. We'd either change the rules or we'll find a way of making him a member of Parliament.
Johnson won't thank his father for that, because he's always publicly insisted he won't try to become an MP while he's still mayor. And until now, he's repeatedly claimed he has as much chance of becoming Prime Minister as of being decapitated by a frisbee, or of being reincarnated as an olive, or as Elvis Presley. Do you think Boris Johnson will reach the top of the greasy pole?
10 years ago, the idea of Boris Johnson being Prime Minister was laughable. Now, we're not laughing anymore.
There are quite a lot of people in the Tory party who, in their panic, are liable to turn to Boris and say, but he's a winner. Everybody likes him. They all love him. He's popular. And they're desperate for somebody who's popular. Well, I think they'll be very silly if they do that, because it'll mean that they've stopped wanting to be a serious party.
He knows that life is a competition, and he always wants to be top. When people ask me if he wants to be Prime Minister, I always say, no, he's much more ambitious than that. You know, David, as he would put it, David Cameron, who read PPE as Prime Minister, he wants to do better than that.
So what does he want to be?
Well, you'll have to ask him, Michael.
Look, this is just full marks to Rachel for causing maximum chaos. She's joking.
Well, you did want to be world king before.
She's joking around.
Would you like to be Prime Minister?
Well, I would like to be the lead singer of an international rock group. I mean, that was my aim. Or guitarist. I would love to have been a world-famous painter, or indeed a composer. There are many, many things that I would like to have done or to be able to do.
But would you like to be Prime Minister?
I think it's a very tough job being Prime Minister. Very tough job. I mean, obviously, if the ball came loose from the back of a scrum, which it won't, or of course it'd be a great thing to have a crack at, but it's not going to happen.
Do you have any doubts about your ability to fulfil the role of Prime Minister?
I think people who don't have doubts or anxieties about their ability to do things probably have something slightly terrifyingly awry. We all have worries and insecurities, but I think I've done it. I think we've done a pretty good job so far in City Hall, and that's what I want to continue to do.
Throughout his life, people have underestimated Boris Johnson. But he's shown himself to be a far cannier player of the political game than he likes to let on. And he's now gone further than ever before in admitting his desire for the top job.
Okay, I've got that one. Oh, yes.
His charisma and wit have helped make him the most popular politician in the land, and he now resembles the great comic actors of the past who yearn to play Hamlet. But his life story so far suggests that if Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson were to become the country's leading man, the British people would spend his time in office on the very edge of their seats.
On Newsnight later, reaction to the Cyprus bailout deal and a look at the future of the Eurozone. That's in half an hour after Never Mind the Buzzcocks.